Good evening and welcome to the Dallas Architecture Forum's panel discussion on the evolving suburban dream, housing design in the suburbs. My name is Nate E. Daly, the director of the forum, and we're delighted that you've joined us. This evening we have three outstanding speakers for us. Brad Bell from UTA CAPPA will moderate the panel, and the panelists will be Andre Brumfield from Gensler and Patrick Craine from Practice. We'll introduce them in a few minutes. We're delighted that our season sponsors make our panel series possible. We'd like to thank them. Galaxy Modern for their amazing support. Purdy McGuire, another very valued panel season sponsor. Turner Construction, fantastic supporter of the forum. And Walter P. Moore. Again, all of these panel season sponsors make this series possible, so we thank them for their support very much. And now I'm very pleased to introduce Brad Bell, who will moderate this evening's panel. Brad has a very long and distinguished resume, so in the interest of time, we'll just touch on a few things. But Brad is the director of the School of Architecture at UTA CAPPA. He's been awarded the UT Arlington's President's Medal for Teaching Excellence, and last year he received the TxA Award for Outstanding Contributions to Education. Brad sits on the boards of AIA Dallas, AIA Fort Worth, and on the board of the forum, where he also chairs our lecture programming committee. Brad, we're honored that you've agreed to moderate this evening's panel, and I'm pleased to welcome Brad Bell. Welcome.
Thank you, Nate, for that introduction, and welcome everyone to tonight's panel. I'm going to take just a few moments to introduce our panelists and then give a short introduction to our topic this evening, the evolving suburban dream, housing design in the suburbs. Our first panelist tonight is Andre Brumfield, who's a principal and design director at Gensler Chicago office and serves as the firm's global cities and urban design leader, applying his 23 years of experience in revitalizing and repositioning urban environments to shape equitable, accessible communities. His extensive portfolio comprises citywide master planning and high-density urban infill to emerging urban district redevelopment, mixed income housing, and neighborhood and community revitalization. Andre's visionary yet realistic revitalization plans have been successfully implemented in economically challenged areas throughout the world. Andre is a member of the Chicago Plan Commission and the Board of Trustees for Chicago Architecture Center. Our next panelist is Patrick Craine, who's the founder and director of Practice and Architectural Office. The office is a design-build firm that engages in creating socially informed and culturally relevant architectures that take advantage of the built environment's ability to enable, empower, and make resilient the diverse agendas of the public it interacts with. The office strongly believes in the performative capacity of design, where material devices instigate situations and give agency to the actors in the network in which it exists. Patrick has taught graduate design studio at both Columbia University and the University of Texas at Arlington, and he holds 2 master's degrees in architecture, the first from the University of Texas at Arlington and the second from Columbia University. He has experience in both design and construction and has been in the business of building since 2008. He has received numerous awards and recognition for his work, including the Lucille Smizer Lowenfish Memorial Prize for Design Excellence, and designed the winning project for the MoMA PS1 Young Architects Program in partnership with Andreas Schack Office for Political Innovation. Tonight's panel marks the third in a year-long series the forum is doing on housing. The first, conducted on May 9th, 2019, focused on housing in relationship to development and real estate. The second panel was held on February 4th of 2020 and focused on housing resiliency in the wake of the tornado that came through in parts of DFW in 2019. Tonight's panel will now build off of that foundation to look at how housing, and specifically housing outside of our CBD and the urban core, are evolving, and how the visions and maybe even dreams have been met or potentially failed to deliver. We will explore in what way we have been led astray or even misguided by our narratives, or how we are potentially on the cusp of typological change. D Magazine noted several weeks ago that while DFW has the second fastest growing region still behind Phoenix, that Dallas County contributed less than 300 new residents this past year, while Collin and Denton counties grew by 120,000 residents. If nothing else, rates in areas of growth and expansion alone should force us to confront some inescapable truths that are deeply impacting our built environment. In the 1950s, the post-World War consumer base paired with the mass production and the third wave of the Industrial Revolution to give us the birth of suburbia. Levittown, Pennsylvania, seen here on the left, marked the now infamous starting point for what originally focused on cost-effective housing solutions, but also brought about many different divisive outcomes. Now we see suburban poche in almost every corner of our country, filling in spaces surrounding our city centers, bound only by geographic features or infrastructural delineation. When left to its own devices and seen from an aerial perspective, the boundless growth can seem to have no limitation. It's almost more textural when encountered in the scale of cities like Chicago, LA, Phoenix, Atlanta, and our own Dallas-Fort Worth. More locally, we were reminded of the writings of the late David Dillon, architecture critic of the Dallas Morning News, in his piece entitled "Big Mess on the Prairie, the Ubiquitous North Dallas Special." This article lampoons the style mashup of so much of what populates the suburban design frontiers. And as a more recent pendulum swing, responding to the decades of expansion and generational change, Mark Lamster, the current architecture critic for the Dallas Morning News, provides us with the Uptown Special. The semi-urban middle ground is vulnerable to many of the same Dillon criticisms, but now at a very different market rate. Certainly, there are some thoughts that diversity of housing stock and design innovation will help some of our current challenges, or that programmatic, economic, and infrastructural cross-pollination can provide a catalyst for change. But tonight, as we prepare to hear from our panelists, we know that we have all probably spent more time in our homes this past year than ever before. We've spent more time thinking about our immediate communities and how our time, energy, and innovation can be leveraged for change for what we want to see happen in the world around us. As a group here tonight that is invested in the design outcome at a variety of scales, we must engage with the most pervasive fabric of our city, the suburbs. Tonight, we will hear from each of our panelists and then have a short discussion, followed by a Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of our screen, and we'll try to get it to as many of these questions as possible at the end of the evening. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Andre at this point.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank the Dallas Architectural Forum for inviting me to take part of this panel. Even though I am an outsider, I do feel at home here, at least virtually. So thank you again for the invitation. I just wanted to share, and first I want to make sure that everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Very good. Over my 20-plus year career, the first 3 years were ironically spent doing a lot of, if you will call it, new urbanist greenfield master planning. And this was my first 3 years, roughly at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, mostly in Chicago. Some work that I actually did enjoy for a period of time in Baldwin Park, where we introduced more than 4,000 units of housing, along with a broad range of uses, including a town center, as well as recreational uses. Quite a bit of that has been built up over the past 20 years. Shortly after that, worked on Glenview Naval Air Station, just north of Chicago by about 50 miles or so, a former military base that looked to adopt the new urbanism principles and convert a large tract of land, over 500 acres, into basically suburban residential development. And even though there was a broad range of housing types that were introduced, including townhomes, predominantly it was single-family detached homes on large suburban lots. And we also developed a series of guidelines that really spoke to how to develop the land over time, with new developers coming in to really fill out the rest of the site. And most of this has been built up over the past 16 years. And the last suburban project that I worked on a residential, from a residential standpoint, was Prairie Crossing, about 70 miles northwest of Chicago. At that time, touted the world's first conservation, or nation's first conservation community. A very strong client who grew up on the south side of Chicago and wanted to create a unique suburban experience here in Grays Lake. And I'd like to hang here for just 1 second, because this was still very much early on in my career. And just to be very direct, in one of the huge public meetings where we were actually announcing the next phase of this development, I was one of the few people of color there, and the issue of affordability came up, and it came up from our client, who was actually looking to introduce townhomes that were, quote, affordable, that were at roughly about 2,200 square feet each, with a lower price point than the single-family detached homes. And this stuck with me for the balance of my career, this exchange, where a number of people were saying that there's a reason why they left Chicago, there's a reason why they came from Milwaukee to be part of this. And I was getting frustrated with the conversation, and basically spoke up and asked everyone if they were thinking about why they moved to this community, raising their families actually grow up, they go off to college, or they go to actually have another career after high school, and they want to come back to the neighborhood that they grew up, and they're just starting their family. They may not be able to afford that single-family detached home on a near acre lot to the tune of $900,000. Are you saying that they don't have a future here in the community that I grew up in? And I initially thought I was going to get fired, let alone tarred and feathered and ran out the room. But it did begin the conversation of what affordability meant for Grays Lake. And I think for me, what affordability really meant in terms of how we actually define it. And I think it speaks to, the idea of how we could actually introduce a broad range of housing types, even in our suburban markets, that do allow for people of all price points and all incomes to at least have the opportunity to live in suburban communities. And the idea of a focus on affordable and mixed income housing is something that I've actually been focusing on for the past 18 to 20 years of my career. And I appreciate the slide that Brad had up that really spoke to the missing middle. And I think this is something that we all have to think about in terms of what are the other housing types that we could actually explore that still offer affordability and offer workforce housing for those people who are actually working in our retail centers, in our suburban neighborhoods, those people who are actually working in the service industry. There's no reason why they can't have an opportunity to actually live in the communities where they're actually working in. So, I think this idea of the housing type, and I'm sure there's others on this panel, Nate and Patrick, who will speak to this, I think is something that we should continue to explore. And if we think about how other cities have been actually dealing with affordable housing and mixed income housing and workforce housing, the city of Minneapolis did something very dynamic, which was the idea of eliminating single family zoning. And I think this is going to be very instrumental when they actually start to think about different housing types that they could actually not only include in some of the previously zoned areas of their city that were dominated by single family homes, but also allow for other uses, complementary uses, such as retail and commercial development, to be located in their neighborhoods. So they don't have to be specifically located in other parts of the city. They could actually be embedded, if you will, in the future of their neighborhoods. And we've been doing a lot of work with the city of San Diego on both the public and the private side. And they are actually going through a citywide master plan update. And what's key to this master planning update, as they've been building out quite a bit in their low density areas in terms of new employment centers and also in terms of single family homes on the outlying parts of the city, they have started to realize that segregating the uses, if you will, has really done the region and the city itself a great harm. And this slide really speaks to it. In the one neighborhood that we're working in, Mira Mesa, there are 80,000 workers who actually come in and commute into the to the neighborhood. 32,000 actually leave, and only just under 8,000 of those residents actually work and live. So what the city is looking to do in the updating of their plan for the city is to really looking at ways that they could actually start to blend more of these uses. And it's all tied to vehicle miles traveled and how they can actually reduce those vehicle miles traveled from people where places where they actually live to their employment destinations, and start to get those two uses closer and get those uses more clustered. So what they're looking to do is create a more, and I'm sure we'll probably hear a little bit about this from others, a true 15-minute neighborhoods where people can not only live and work, but of course play and recreate, and how they can actually start to create more of these mixed use clusters within their select neighborhoods. And they're actually going through this now, not only from a regulatory standpoint, but they're also working with developers to see what they can actually do to have a larger blended team that not only looks at introducing retail or commercial uses, particularly with the life sciences market being very hot, but how can they actually create more of the urban villages and what they're calling urban employment villages, where people can truly live and work in the vicinity of where they actually live. And last but not least, before I turn it over to the other panels, it's interesting. We've been involved in a lot of mall repositioning, if not scraping the entire site to work with not only developers, but suburban entities who are looking to readdress some of their dying malls and the white elephants, and to turn it into what could be a town center. This is one of several projects we've been working on in Charleston, South Carolina. The idea of creating a new town center that not only allows for more commercial development, but also, again, that blended use of residential commercial development with retail to create a new town center. And it's also in some ways where we've been finding, working with some suburban entities, particularly on the public side, where they actually can find a way to introduce higher density housing in an urban environment that they're trying to create, but in a very suburban area of town. But all this really speaks to, the idea of when we think about affordability, we think about residential in particular, what does this mean in terms of, the new way of thinking about how we truly create 20-minute neighborhoods, and the idea of what that means in terms of looking at this through the lens of equity, not only in housing diversity, but also affordable and workforce housing, and other ways that we can actually think about the quality of life and how we can actually enhance that by having those uses within that 15-minute radius. And I think this not only is certainly for our urban areas, but also as we start to rethink our suburban areas and what those needs are, meeting the people where the needs are at. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our next panelist. And again, thank you for your time, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you, Andre.
Okay, hello. And I also would like to say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here to discuss this topic. I have a very small design build practice here in Dallas. And as Brad mentioned, I've spent a few years teaching both at Columbia and at UTA. And I think today my presentation will be a little bit of kind of attempt from me to bridge together those two worlds, and is maybe a little bit more of a provocation and a conversation starter than it is a a look at the work of our office. But anyway, we can talk about that when we're done, but here we go. So just as a start, and I'm sure that many of you watching this are in Dallas and are very much aware of this, but DFW, the Metroplex, is the fastest growing metro area in the country and is projected to remain that way for years to come. At the fourth largest metro area in the country with 7.6+ million residents, we rank just behind cities like Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York. A business, oh, there's Chicago, there's Los Angeles, there's New York. A business-friendly government and economy and relative low cost of living with seemingly endless possibilities for expansion in a copy-paste urbanism that, while oftentimes is beautiful, is driving corporate relocations that are a major contributor to a massive housing shortage and rapidly rising prices. In DFW, I think that there are 4 major housing strategies or development strategies that I think can be classified as types. The first one being the production home development, the second being the inner city redevelopment strategy, the third being the luxury apartment building, and the last one being the mixed-use urban village. Each one of these typologies can be thought of as an architectural invention that's responding to a diverse set of inputs, constraints, and attempting to reach a different segment of the residential market. There's one of these types, though, that I think is outpacing the rest, and in terms of its growth and in terms of its visibility as a housing typology in the city, and that is the suburban single-family home. It's something that has typified what is considered housing in North Texas and many other places in the country. It's easily executed, it's relatively low cost and comparatively simple when compared to the other typologies, which allows it to expand and gives it the greatest ability to grow and house people as the city grows. And it has not only become a desired lifestyle in the city as homeownership is at its highest and rental vacancies are also at their highest, so less people renting, more people owning homes, but it's also become a desired lifestyle around the world. This is an image from a suburban development in China. And with single family housing starts up 30% for last year in a population that's on track to surpass Chicago in the next few years, I think that we as designers ought to dig in to this prolific yet underdeveloped architectural typology. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach that we try to take in the office and the way that we've kind of developed work inside design studios in the school or in the university. So in our office, we believe that architecture is a performative phenomenon, that objects, places, buildings, institutions, infrastructures, rooms, policies, materials, and technologies are all designed with the capacity to render certain situations more or less likely. The unavoidable agency of things makes architecture a social act. The way we try to work in the office is to design with the understanding that things do politics. The placement of a door, the transparency of a surface is more than just a formal or programmatic decision. It has much larger implications. The impact of a building extends far beyond the boundaries of its site, its neighborhood, or its city. It is part of a complex network of things that both inform and project our designs. Let's take a look at what I mean by providing this kind of reading, this architectural reading of the typical suburban house. I'm assuming that most of us here look at this with a little bit of prejudice. Some may wonder if we can even consider this architecture. I think we can. If we look through the traditional lens of our discipline, we may see something that's not designed. It lacks good details. The materials are just references to historical methods of construction. The proportions and alignments might not be to our liking, and the relationship in response to the site is the same wherever it pops up. But if we take a performative approach instead of a formal one, we see a house that's just one element in a network of many that are all connected and very much designed. In order for us to design here, we need to understand the context in which this piece of architecture is made. We have to understand it as a financial product that's related to retirement accounts, Wall Street, insurance companies, credit scores, and server farms, and government regulations. We have to see it as a means of family making that exists in the network of public and private schools, fertility clinics, furniture companies, automobiles, hospital rooms, adoption agencies, toy stores, and landfills. We have to see it as part of the internet economy, as an Airbnb, or as a set for a YouTube channel, or the office of a blogger, or the international manufacturing headquarters of a tech company. We need to read it as a temporary destination of a number of resources that were extracted, processed, engineered, tested, registered, and assembled. We have to acknowledge it as an organism in an ecosystem of infrastructures that is one of the last commons in our cities. We must acknowledge its roles in the debates around immigration, around labor, around sprawl, around poverty, and excess. We have to recognize its ability to do politics, as it is the primary place where matters of fact are translated into matters of concern. I believe that there's a huge potential for evolution here if we consider all of this network and as we consider all these things to be materials that we can work with. In my opinion, as a discipline, both inside of the university and in practice, we have lost our seat at the table when it comes to the micro design of these architectures. I think, as we just saw on the grand scale, on the planning and the master planning of these communities, we're very much involved and at the table. But as the actual house is concerned, I think we've lost our seat at the table because we tend to too often take a formal or aesthetic approach to design instead of a performative one. We're unable to transform or take advantage of the potentials found here because we're overly concerned with out of context precedents or outdated and unsuccessful versions of modernism, or a material and construction logic that seems pretentious, excessive, or overly complicated to the decision makers and the public. I'm in no way saying that design or aesthetics or a formal approach or a desire for radical transformation is an enemy here. I just think it needs to be evolved from the inside out. In our small office, we're in a constant struggle with our desire to create something that we think is beautiful and intelligent from our perspective as designers, and the tension that exists between that and the social, economic, and cultural reality that our designs produce. It has caused us to begin to search for a new aesthetic, one that is more tolerant of mistakes and unexpected outcomes, one that tends to favor affordability and ease of implementation as opposed to one that's laser focused on a reveal or an architectural trick as a defining element of the project. We have found that working this way also encourages us to consider all of the actors in the network of things that make up our site. We hope that through this approach, we can evolve the idea of architecture as a means of revolt, as was such a powerful and necessary means of exploration in the 60s and 70s, into a means of evolution where our matters of concern are made resonant with the landowners, developers, real estate agents, the municipalities, home buyers, corporate offices that are looking to relocate, laborers that construct these structures, and so on. in this arena, I think that we're seen as a luxury and not as something that's needed to be engaged. And I think that currently we see the results of that in the kind of stagnant, well, not necessarily stagnant, but the way that these architectures have developed away from our core principles as designers. So kind of to sum it up, my call to action or contribution to the discussion here tonight is to not look at these architectures, these suburban houses, these single family developments as something that's broken or undesirable, but rather to see them as something that's working amazingly well. It's working so well that it's become incredibly hard to transform. So my goal is to have a conversation around and to continue working in the office and in the university to develop a performative approach to design that is understanding the financial systems, the share economy, the productive nature of domestic space, and all these other things that are just as much materials for us to consider and get our hands on as is a 2x4 or a pallet of hardy siding or 60-foot lots in semi-gated communities. And my hope is that by taking on this holistic and inclusive view, we can align our interests as designers and thinkers in the design world with those at the helm and who are making the decisions, and that we can put design back at the center of the discussion. That's it.
Thanks, Patrick. We're going to now switch over to a little bit of a conversation, and I would encourage everybody to go ahead and submit questions at the bottom. We'll spend probably about 10 minutes or so, maybe 12 minutes, and a little bit of a conversation here with the three of us, give you some time to formulate questions and submit them at the bottom. Let me just start by saying thank you to Andre and Patrick for your presentations. Really great opportunity to see where both of you are coming from. And in many ways, it kind of sets up my first question. Having not seen the presentations before coming in, this actually segues perfectly into one of the things that I was really interested in talking with you about heading into this panel discussion, and had in some ways maybe mentioned ahead of time was, a couple of years ago in an interview that Vishaan Chakrabarty had done with Mark Lamster, he cautioned Dallas, so to speak, that he said, there's a temptation that Dallas wants to be like a lot of other big cities, in its rush to grow up or to change or to, learn certain lessons. It will emulate the patterns and behaviors of other big cities. And so, and I certainly understand the tendencies of watching cities that are ahead of us in population scale or in either coast in terms of some of the things that deal with infrastructure. And we often talk about that relative to Chicago and LA and maybe Atlanta in some regards. I'm interested in this kind of global local tension though, right? Because I think, Andre, you beautifully set this up, especially on that last slide, and in the way that we're rethinking neighborhoods through equity, right? You kind of give us some global strategies to think about, right? The 15-minute walkable neighborhood that then breaks out into a number of other strategies that you've used throughout your career in your thinking about not just equity and affordability, but many ways in which you conceive of the neighborhood itself, right? That you've applied in a number of different locations. And then Patrick, you almost start from an incredibly hyper-local analysis of Dallas and a way of understanding it and the thing that gives it its kind of character. And you say, okay, how do we then get our hands inside of that and begin to utilize that as a kind of material, right? A way to then build from that in terms of creating design strategies and being hyper tactical about that. So I'm really interested in maybe your takes on where in which local and global strategies mix, don't mix, provide us ways of creating identity where identity is lost. Dallas strives to be a city on a global stage. I'm wondering what your take is on that as it applies to suburban, the future of the suburban built environment.
Patrick, do you want to go first, or shall I jump in here? I can jump in. It's interesting. I just should say full disclosure. I'm originally from Milwaukee, and I came to Chicago about 24 years ago by way of Oakland and Seattle. And I was here during the glory days of former Mayor Richard M. Daley, and had the pleasure of working with the Department of Planning on a number of neighborhood efforts, master planning efforts, and affordable housing. And what was interesting to see him and his staff. And Daley was so curious about cities and so curious about what other cities were doing. He had staff rotating and circulating, going across not only the country, but the globe. He would find something in the New York Times that Dayton, Ohio was doing, related to parks. He'll send someone down there to Dayton, Ohio. He's curious to see what Atlanta was doing at the time with the Beltway. What is this Beltway thing? Go down to Atlanta and find out. He would see what things were, how transit-oriented development was actually being done overseas, and he would send his staff overseas. He was always borrowing from other cities. And one of the things that he did do very well was talk about the public realm and how the public realm for Chicago not only could be reestablished downtown, make its way ultimately into the neighborhoods, but also he was talking at that time of how to create better links, if you will, to the suburbs, because he understood that, the city was also functioning as a region as well. So I say all that because it's interesting, because every city always wants what the other city has, right? And it really wasn't until Obama's run for presidency, his first term, where Chicago actually realized that it was a second-tier global city. It never thought of themselves that way. And I think it's always interesting, particularly with friends that I do have in Dallas or I do have in Houston, and the things that you feel that your city is doing correctly or maybe should be doing better. The best thing, way I guess I can conclude this rant is that we're always borrowing from other cities, and cities should be looking to other cities to see what's working and, more importantly, what's not. And I think as it relates to our suburban versus urban, as we've been experiencing over the past 14 months, there were a number of people 10 months ago that were predicting the death of all of our cities, that everyone would be going out to the suburbs. And what were the suburbs looking to do to actually position for this growth and this exodus? And we've seen some of that, but I think this is an opportunity to really think about, what do we want our suburban areas to be beyond just housing? What kind of housing types do we want to introduce? What does this mean for quality of life that goes beyond providing a very good education for our children? What are those day-to-day activities that people want to see? And I think it's interesting to see how a number of mall redevelopments are looking at this, especially in suburban areas, where they're trying to create an urban town center in their suburban area. So maybe I'll stop here, because I'm sure Patrick has a number of things to say on this. So.
Yeah, for me, I think in response to this kind of global, local, looking other places mentality, the first thing that popped into my mind is that, kind of like was shown in the presentation that I pieced together. I feel like the formal appearance and the formal approach to suburban development has lost its, or maybe not lost its sense of place, but it's become a little bit ubiquitous. The lot size, the zoning, the way that you can, do a garage from the front or do them rear loading, or, there's kind of this thing that's happened to where it's become a little bit of a product. And I think that one of one of the things that I see moving forward, just the, last week and have gone a number of times to Bentonville, Arkansas, which I think is like a massive laboratory for what I would consider suburban development, and is approaching it in a very, very, very interesting way.
Interesting is one word, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Everybody knows that Walmart's headquarters, and the Walmart, the Walton family is there, and they have done a really, really beautiful job of revitalizing the downtown and deploying these strategies that, like, when you walk into a restaurant, the menu looks the same and the materials on the wall look the same, and the construction logics are the same, and the way that they're doing townhouses where there used to be single family lots, it looks like it could be anywhere. It could be in Dallas, it could be wherever. But the city at the same time has created an identity for itself, which happens to be for them in these kind of hiking and mountain biking trails that they've spent hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in developing. That's created a sense of place and an identity inside of that ubiquitous kind of wrapper. Their kind of modern version of a townhouse is very nice and could be anywhere, like I said, but the way that people are experiencing that city and providing, getting enjoyment out of that city is very much related to the development of something that is informing and allowing those architectures to exist. But it's kind of creating a sense of place there. And I think that the thing for me in that, like the learning for that in me, is that those architectural typologies, it would be a beautiful thing to me if they evolved to represent the place that they're in. And I'm not making an argument for the bike racks in the kitchen or something like this, or whatever that would mean. But I think that we see that the architecture, that the design community is kind of answering the question the same way, no matter where it is. And I think we can, maybe look at how the pandemic has changed the way people work and do school, and see that there's an opportunity for architecture to respond there, that these typologies of these suburban homes could learn from this last year, and that there could be evolution there. And those are extreme circumstances of a city that's based around the mountain bike tourism industry and the pandemic that we're just getting through, and the way that it relates to architecture. But I think if you take that down to the less extreme scale, that we should see a little bit more variation in the typology based on a kind of understanding of the everyday real life uses, and not so much the top down,
Right.
This is the kind of graphic standard way I think you should live your life. But if we could receive a little more information back and be relevant to people that are building these places, that would be a beautiful thing.
Yeah. So I want to ask one more question before we kind of jump over to Q&A real quick, and maybe you each have some ways that you'd address this. So each of you are talking about a kind of awareness of the heterogeneity of opportunity and ways in which the future begins to develop in response to some of this in regards to housing and suburbia and maybe development and I think Patrick, a couple of the terms that you're using in terms of the network of things, and I'm thinking here of systems thinking potentially factors in ways that we understand the integration of the multiplicity of factors that begin to influence the way that we organize. For me, and not to just try to pile everything into one question, but I appreciated that, Andre, you started off with this question of affordability. And, I think also, in this past year, we've grown, in an awareness of many different things related to equity, inclusion. What I'm interested here is, how in a way in which, in laying a lot of things out, right, and the way in which we understand that there's a lot of different things that could be placed in a larger table and begin to kind of sort through them, do we begin to prioritize, right? Because, circling back to Levittown and circling back to the way in which I even see are thinking about suburbia, it's easy to, think about it in terms of product. It's easy to think about it in terms of finances. It's easy to think about it and see it through the kind of homogeneous lens in terms of single family and production housing on one hand. I think we really have to push for certain prioritization of certain issues and certain things in order for that to not get lost. And so I'm curious to know, either for you as a practitioner, Patrick and Andre, or in conversation, how does your career, how does the last year, how does your thinking begin to inform certain things that you want to prioritize when you think about what I think could be a very complex set of issues when it comes to, examining the opportunities for, housing typology and different ways that we could really explore this.
Well, maybe I could start off. The best way I maybe could probably start to at least address parts of your question is, I think it's, the demographics of how our cities are evolving are going to be very interesting in terms of the trends. What was it 8 years ago? And I say this with great annoyance because we do a lot of residential development, and all due respect to some of my developer clients out there, everyone was designing toward and for the millennial, right? Everyone was trying to find out where they can actually get into market in terms of the micro units that were selling like hotcakes on the East Coast, and certainly doing very well in the Bay Area. Even my hometown, Milwaukee, of all places, were building micro units. I would have never thought that. But guess what? The millennials age.
Right.
The millennials eventually do get families, and some of the millennials have actually been finding their way out to the suburbs. So we've talked a lot about housing types. We've talked a lot about affordability, but again, I kind of keep coming back to that way of life and the quality of life. The millennials are, as they age and they actually start to have their families, they're also carrying with them expectations of how they actually would like to live. Right, and they may not be able to afford, that huge a house on a 75-foot wide lot, but there could be options as they start to think about how they could adjust to suburban living, but taking some of those urban components with them. On the other end, there's the seniors, and how we probably should be thinking about more opportunities, for them in terms of the housing that they live in. Because my mother, who's turning 75 years old, thank God she's still in great health. She likes to get around. She certainly does not want to be in a nursing home or a senior building. However, if we think about what that could mean in our suburban typologies and suburban way of life, and actually how we can make sure that those seniors, if you will, are still very much part of the community, very much part of the urban fabric, very much wanting to be connected to, at least some elements of urban life and lifestyle. I think, if we start to, think about these kind of two opposite ends in terms of what our residential population could be and wants to be in our suburban areas, beyond just being dominated, as Patrick clearly illustrated, and I kind of hinted at least early on, these stamped out single family detached large lot homes. There has to be a way to create more balance and more diversity, and that goes beyond just affordability. It really speaks to the people that actually make up our suburban environments.
Yeah, and I mean, for me, it's really a question of relevance, and it's been the thing that I have struggled with. And just to be transparent here, we haven't worked on very many large developments. We've gotten a chance to present on two different ones, and we took kind of two different strategies both times, because the first time it didn't go as well as we thought. So I'll just kind of run through
Patrick, we've all had those. Don't worry about it.
So I'll just run through both of those examples and maybe talk about the approach and what our learning was from it, and how I think that it ties back into what I was talking about earlier. But really, it's about relevance, and I think that so much that I certainly am guilty of, and trying to be less guilty of, is coming to the table with an agenda that I put more weight in than the agenda of the client, or those who have maybe the ability to get the project to work. And I think that just from a mindset point of view, like in the first proposal that we did, it was a small, maybe 20 unit kind of redevelopment of 4 lots just outside of Fort Worth. And we kind of came to the table with an agenda of wanting connectivity. We came to the table with an agenda of wanting to set up a way that these kind of what typically function as these small gated communities with a little guard shack in a neighborhood of houses that are maybe nearing the end of their life, as most people see it. It's kind of an opportunistic look. Like, we kind of wanted to go in there and provide a means of redeveloping that neighborhood, where we gave some benefits back to the neighborhood, where we provided a kind of greenway that would connect from one of these parcels to the next as homes got bought and demolished and replatted in these little PDs, to kind of set up an intelligence that people could march from one to the next. But it kind of fell. I mean, everybody thought that it was neat. No, everybody said, "Hey, good job. That's super neat. It looks great. We got the density numbers that we needed to get. We did kind of, checked all the boxes." But because we wanted to provide, like, I think the biggest barrier on that one was that we had different prices of homes inside of the same development. And that's kind of something we brought to the table that was very important to us, that we weren't building a community for the 700,000 house guy, and then the next place over would be for the 900,000 house guy, and then at some point there would be a place for the 200 and 250 and $300,000 house, which seems to be the lowest that we're able to provide. 250 to 350 seems to be the bottom of the barrel, closer to 350 and 4 these days for single family houses. And I think that in that we had to, we should have approached that, leaving our agenda and our ethics should have been very much, like a Trojan horse, should have been tied to the client's agenda much more. And I think that, just from being a young practitioner and spending a lot of time in the university, I just think that it's something we don't spend enough time on with students and with the development of students to one, equip them with an agenda and to understand that design is social, and that we are designing cities, and that we are impacting the way people live and interact with each other and have the ability to, pay their bills and do all these things. But that, just looking at everything and saying not good enough all the time has made it to where we don't get to play in the sandbox like we should, So that's kind of my main takeaway is recovering relevance at this scale. If somebody wants to do a mixed use development, if somebody wants to do a big, kind of urban redevelopment, whether it's inside the middle of the city or out in Frisco or Plano or whatever, they know that they need us. But nobody thinks that they need us once we get the plat done, and once we do the master plan, then the builders take over from there. The builders and the developers take over from there. And I think that we need to regain our seat at the table at that scale.
Well, we've got maybe time for just 1 or 2 questions if we go quickly. What I maybe would like to do is pick one for each of you that applies to some of the things that you brought up in your presentation. Andre, you spoke about the City of Milwaukee taking out single-family housing zoning in a particular location, if I recall. There's a question that says, some public policy advocates argue that modern zoning codes in the United States are a hindrance to making housing available to the next generation. especially single-family zoning. What are your thoughts on how modern zoning impact the future of affordable housing for the next generation and the evolution of urban architectural design?
Well, I guess I would start, and this is one of my major gripes. I think we have to get the fields of architecture and design much closer tied to public policy and how policy impacts or has the ability to impact the built environment. I think a number of us don't understand it the way we should. I think a number of us basically see what's allowable in zoning, or we actually rely on the work that we're doing with the developer to upzone or change zoning. But I think if we start from and this goes back to undergraduate and graduate school, and really get the schools of public policy closer with the schools of architecture, closer with the schools of urban design, and really truly understand how one really influences the other. I think we can actually start finding different ways, as professionals, to really make sure that we're thinking through the lens of public policy as we're designing. We're finding different ways where we can actually influence public policy for the betterment of the built environment by creating what we think are more thoughtful approaches to design, more, if you will, balanced, more equitable, and also, if you will, more affordable. So, I am one of those people who do think that zoning, in a lot of cases, particularly single-family zoning, has held the neighborhoods back, particularly distressed neighborhoods where there's not room for other uses to come in, and even stable neighborhoods, whether they're working class or strong upper middle class neighborhoods, that happen to age out because you have great homes where they're not being handed down to the next generation, because that next generation has either left the city, or they actually have a different lifestyle that they're living that doesn't, equate to the house that they grew up in. But those same neighborhoods are really, if you will, tied, from having other assets that could come in to actually change their neighborhood. And it goes beyond just housing typologies. Again, it speaks to retail, commercial development, other amenities, that I think that, are sometimes, discouraged, or just not allowed because of zoning. So again, I really think as designers, architects, urban designers, it's getting the school of thought much more tied closely to public policy, and really kind of, starting at an early age in our profession and understanding better how one influences the other.
Appreciate that.
Yeah, and just real quick, one of the things that I find interesting about that and about your comment about that is that it requires us that if you want to try something new, you have to go somewhere else, right? Like the only place inside the city that you can try something new is an area that has got so far gone. You know what I mean? Like people love to propose new solutions for areas like around Fair Park, right? But that's because there's obviously a situation that's developed over there that it's crying out for architectural invention. But yeah, it's
right.
amazing that we, like, if you want to do a mixed-use development or try a new typology or whatever, because of zoning, it's basically contributing to sprawl, which is not necessarily a bad thing in itself, but it's just leaving this pre-existing fabric and it's strengthening these existing typologies.
Patrick, I want to get you one quick question before we have to wrap up here. This one is actually directed for you. It says, your presentation touched on the way in which architects have historically neglected or been uninterested in the middle class single-family suburban home. In your opinion, what role does design education play? Is the hierarchical divide between architects and speculative builders, and how might it be mediated?
Man, I think that's a great question. And I think that it kind of gets at the heart of what I was trying to get to in the presentation, is that, I do think that on the scale of the university, on the scale of the profession in general, that we have abandoned that scale, and we've abandoned that fabric, that it's, I don't want to say that people think that it's beneath us, but it's just, and it's also very hard to, have an office or a practice that just specializes in that. Obviously, there's bigger dollars and bigger budgets and in other areas of design. But I think that bridging that gap is important. And I think that when you look back at, whether it's, Frank Lloyd Wright or it's Korb or whoever you want to look at, like the house was a speculative vehicle, like very much so. And it's not that it's not anymore today, but they're more reinterpretations of those speculations than they are necessarily putting new stuff on the table. And I'm sure there are many exceptions to that. We can have a whole conversation around that. But I do think that that there is a disconnect there for sure, and I do think that there is a little upward turn noses towards what comprises the majority of our housing in DFW, being these single family homes. And I think that the way to recover it is by having discussions like we're having today, by looking at the fact that, through the pandemic, basically there's been a reprogramming or a rezoning, so to speak, of all of these buildings that we're talking about today. And, thinking about the way that, outside forces have kind of put a spotlight on the way that architecture has not evolved, that it has stayed stagnant, should be a call to universities and to practitioners and everybody to kind of look to jump back in. And yeah, while it's not $20 million mixed use development budget, there's certainly much more fabric to be worked with. So I think that there's plenty of meat out there for people to get involved with it, but it's just whether we want to take an interest and dive back in to that discussion.
Well, Andre, any last words? Any final words?
Not sure that I do, other than to say that I think to answer the previous question, or add to the answer to the previous question, I think we as a whole need to educate the public better.
Yeah.
And this is not necessarily talking about the public good, but how zoning does truly influence the built environment, how zoning does impact their daily lives, how zoning could actually, at least looking at zoning in a different way, could really speak to some of the amenities that they probably would like to see in their neighborhood, where they don't have to drive 25 or 30 minutes on the freeway to get to their restaurant or to get to their workout area or to get to their other amenities. So, all of these things, when we talk about amenities, it does come back down to zoning, and it does come back down to how public officials either, realistically look at it or perceive it. And when I say public officials, it's not just those in planning, it's those elected officials that are really governing, our jurisdictions. So I think, there needs to be kind of a rethinking in terms of how we actually present, educate the public, and talk about how zoning truly impacts their built environment and how it impacts their everyday life.
Well, I appreciate both of you in terms of your contribution tonight, your thoughts. Sorry that we could not get to all the questions in the Q&A, but really great discussion, great presentation, and really valuable in terms of our thinking here on this topic. So I want to turn it back over to Nate and say how much we just appreciate you being here tonight. So,
well, thank you again.
Yeah, Andre and Brad, thank you both, and Patrick. All three of you have really brought some very thought-provoking discussion about an incredibly important topic, and we're grateful for it. Also want to thank Ian and Isaac, who helped organize this program, and all of you for joining us tonight. So once again, thank you very much. Good evening.